The rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof of the abandoned warehouse like machine gun fire, each drop a percussion in the symphony of Elena Voss's racing heart. Blood seeped through her tactical vest, warm and sticky against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she reloaded the silence-wrapped Glock for what she prayed would be the final time tonight. 22 down. One more to go. Creating this intense story took considerable time and effort to craft. If you're enjoying this thrilling tale, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories. The warehouse stretched before her like a cathedral of shadows and broken dreams. Rusted shipping containers towered in the darkness, their surfaces scarred by decades of salt air and neglect. This had once been the heart of Port Valencia's maritime district, where her grandfather had worked the docks for 43 years until arthritis claimed his hands. Now it served as the perfect hunting ground for those who believed themselves untouchable. Elena pressed herself against container 47B, its cold metal surface a stark contrast to the fever burning through her system. The adrenaline coursed through her veins like liquid lightning, but beneath it lay something deeper, more primal. 3 months ago, General Marcus Caldwell had stood before the entire 7th Special Operations Division and declared her dead weight. His exact words still echoed in her mind. Specialist Voss is a liability. She lacks the killer instinct necessary for this unit. Recommend immediate reassignment to logistics. The memory tasted like copper and humiliation. 23 men had laughed. 23 soldiers who had shared foxholes with her, who had seen her drag wounded teammates through hostile fire, who had witnessed her outscore half the division in marksmanship trials. Their laughter had followed her out of that briefing room like a plague. Tonight, those same 23 men lay scattered across Port Valencia like broken dolls. Each one eliminated with surgical precision. Each death a punctuation mark in a sentence that began with their mockery and would end with her vindication. The sound of boots on gravel echoed through the warehouse. Heavy, confident, unaware. Elena closed her eyes and let her other senses take control. The footsteps belonged to Sergeant Dutch Kowalski, the last name on her list. Dutch, who had started the slow clap that turned into thunderous applause when General Caldwell delivered his verdict. Dutch, who had whispered pathetic as she gathered her gear and walked away from the only family she'd ever known. Elena's fingers traced the silver locket at her throat, a nervous habit she'd carried since childhood. Inside, a faded photograph of her younger brother Miguel smiled back through the scratched glass. Miguel, who had believed she could conquer the world. Miguel, who would never see her prove them all wrong, because an IED had taken him 6 months before General Caldwell took her dignity. The warehouse had been built in 1967, the same year her grandfather immigrated from El Salvador with nothing but calloused hands and unshakable faith in the American dream. He'd helped construct these very walls, mixing concrete in the suffocating heat of summer, believing he was building something permanent, something that would outlast him. Now it served as the tomb for men who had forgotten what honor meant. Elena? Dutch's voice cut through the rain and darkness. I know you're here, sweetheart. Let's talk about this like civilized people. Sweetheart. The condescension dripped from the word like poison from a blade. She could picture him clearly without looking, 6'3", shoulders like a linebacker, that cocky grin that had charmed his way through half the female population of Fort Braxton. Dutch had always been the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong in General Caldwell's eyes. Until tonight, Elena shifted her position, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Her movements were economical, practiced, honed by thousands of hours of training that General Caldwell had deemed worthless. She thought of Master Sergeant Rivera, her first instructor, who had seen something in the 19-year-old girl fresh out of basic training. You move like smoke, Voss, he'd told her. Some soldiers are hammers. You're a scalpel. The irony wasn't lost on her. Tonight, she'd proven Rivera right in ways he never could have imagined. Container 23 bore the logo of Chun Shipping International, its red dragon emblem barely visible beneath layers of rust and sea spray. Elena had memorized every detail of this place over the past week, studying blueprints, calculating sight lines, identifying escape routes. Planning had always been her strength, the methodical approach that made her invaluable in the field, even when her commanders questioned her resolve. "You can't hide forever," Dutch called out, his voice echoing off the metal walls. 23 good soldiers are dead because of you. Is this what Miguel would have wanted? The mention of her brother's name sent white-hot rage coursing through her system. How dare he invoke Miguel's memory? Miguel, who had written letters from Afghanistan describing Dutch as Elena's guardian angel. Miguel, who had died believing these men were her brothers in arms, never knowing they saw her as nothing more than a burden to be shed at the first opportunity. Elena's tactical watch read, 0347 hours. Dawn was still 3 hours away, but the warehouse felt suspended in eternal night. She thought about the past 8 hours, how it had all begun with a simple phone call. Anonymous tip. 23 targets gathered for what they believed was a private celebration of her downfall. A warehouse party to toast her transfer to logistics, complete with cheap beer and cheaper jokes about the woman who couldn't cut it in their elite unit. They hadn't expected her to show up uninvited. The first elimination had been Staff Sergeant Morrison, stepping out for a cigarette behind container 12C. Quick, quiet, professional. Morrison had trained her in urban warfare tactics, had praised her adaptability and quick thinking. But when General Caldwell asked for opinions on her reassignment, Morrison had nodded his agreement like a bobblehead doll. Captain Hayes had been next, overconfident and drunk on victory bourbon. Hayes, who had recommended her for the unit in the first place, only to withdraw his support when the political winds shifted. His death had been messier than Morrison's, less clinical. Elena had felt something dark uncurl in her chest as she watched the recognition dawn in his eyes. By the 5th elimination, word had spread through their impromptu celebration. Panic set in. These highly trained special operations soldiers, men who had faced down terrorists and insurgents without flinching, found themselves hunted by the woman they had dismissed as weak. The irony was beautiful in its brutality. Now only Dutch remained, the architect of her humiliation. Dutch, who had stood at General Caldwell's right hand during the hearing, whispering poison in his ear. Dutch, who had made it personal in ways that went beyond professional disagreement. "I see your handiwork." Dutch's voice had moved closer, maybe 50 meters to her left. "Impressive stuff, I'll give you that. When did you become such a stone-cold killer, Elena?" The question hung in the air like smoke. When had she become this? The honest answer was that she'd always been this, beneath the surface. The capacity for violence had lived in her bones since childhood, carefully controlled and channeled into productive outlets. The military had given her purpose, direction, a cause worth killing for. But tonight was different. Tonight was personal, Elena thought. About the symbolic weight of this place. Port Valencia had been her family's gateway to America, the place where dreams took root in foreign soil. Her grandfather's ghost walked these docks, and perhaps tonight he would witness his granddaughter's vindication or damnation. She wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. The rain intensified, turning the warehouse into a drum chamber of overlapping rhythms. Water streamed through gaps in the roof, pooling in the uneven concrete floor and reflecting the sparse emergency lighting in fractured patterns. Elena moved through the shadows like she'd been born to them. Every sense heightened to predatory sharpness. Dutch was good. She had to admit that. His approach was methodical, professional, exactly what their training dictated. But he was also predictable, following patterns she'd studied for 3 years of joint operations. Men like Dutch never truly adapted. They simply repeated successful strategies until they stopped working. Tonight was the night they stopped working. Elena reached into her tactical pouch and withdrew a small mirror, using it to observe Dutch's position without exposing herself. They're moving between container 31D and 31E, weapon raised, using proper cover and concealment techniques. He'd learned well from the fate of his 22 companions. But learning and adapting were two different skills entirely. She thought about tomorrow's headlines. Special Forces soldier snaps, kills entire unit. The story would paint her as a disturbed woman who couldn't handle rejection, a cautionary tale about lowering military standards. They would never understand that tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. It was about proving that the woman they'd dismissed as useless was the most dangerous person in the room. The silver locket at her throat seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Miguel's photograph looked up at her with those trusting eyes. The same eyes that had watched her swear her oath of service. "Protect and serve," she whispered to his memory. Tonight, she was protecting the only thing she had left, her honor, and serving justice to those who had forgotten what it meant. But questions lingered in the darkness, as persistent as the rain. What would happen after Dutch was dead? What would happen when the sun rose and 23 bodies were discovered? In this monument to abandoned dreams? Elena had planned the perfect execution, but she'd never considered the aftermath. Perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps some actions were meant to exist in their own moment. Perfect and terrible and complete. The warehouse groaned under the weight of wind and rain, its metal skeleton singing a funeral dirge for the men who would never leave this place. Elena adjusted her grip on the Glock and prepared to write the final sentence of tonight's bloody paragraph. 23 targets. 23 men who had underestimated the woman they called useless. By dawn, they would understand their mistake. Her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee that tasted like punishment and determination in equal measure. The commissary bustled with the controlled chaos of military breakfast, soldiers grabbing quick meals between training routines, couples stealing moments before deployment, the eternal dance of a community built on the understanding that every goodbye might be permanent. Elena had claimed her usual table in the far corner. Back to the wall, eyes on the entrance. Old habits from too many combat zones where complacency meant death. She'd spread her morning intelligence briefings across the scratched formica surface like tarot cards reading her future. Morocco, Syria, 3 potential deployment scenarios. Each one a chance to prove herself worthy of the 7th Special Operations Division's trust. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had approached her table with the cautious optimism of someone bearing uncertain news. Sarah was Elena's closest friend in the unit, perhaps her only real friend anywhere. They'd met during the brutal selection process 2 years prior, both women swimming upstream against a current of institutional doubt and casual misogyny. Where Elena carried herself with coiled intensity, Sarah radiated a calm competence that made even the most skeptical officers take notice. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah had asked, though she was already pulling out the chair across from Elena. Her breakfast tray held the same institutional eggs and overcooked bacon that had sustained military personnel since time immemorial. But she pushed the food around. More than she ate it, Elena had studied her friend's expression with the same attention she gave hostile terrain. Sarah's poker face was usually impeccable, honed by years of competitive bridge with her grandmother and strategic negotiations with military bureaucrats. But this morning, micro-expressions flickered across her features like storm clouds on a distant horizon. "You've heard something," Elena had said. It wasn't a question. In their line of work, information flowed through unofficial channels faster than official ones, carried by whispers in locker rooms and meaningful glances across briefing tables. Sarah had nodded slowly, her dark eyes reflecting a weight Elena recognized but couldn't yet name. General Caldwell called a closed-door session yesterday afternoon. Department heads only. Word is, They're reviewing unit composition ahead of the Morocco deployment. The coffee had turned bitter in Elena's mouth, though perhaps it had been bitter all along, and she'd simply stopped tasting it. Reviewing unit composition was military euphemism for deciding who stayed and who got reassigned to less critical roles. It was the institutional equivalent of natural selection, where only the strongest and most politically connected survived. Elena's daily routine had been built around preparation for exactly this moment. Every morning at 0430, she ran 8 miles. Through the North Carolina countryside, her breath crystallizing in the pre-dawn air as her feet found rhythm on familiar paths. The physical exertion wasn't just about maintaining fitness standards. It was meditation in motion, a time when her mind could process the complex emotional equations that governed military life. She'd learned early that excellence wasn't enough. Being the best shot in the division meant nothing if your commanders doubted your resolve. Acing every tactical assessment was irrelevant if your peers questioned your place among them. Elena had mastered the technical aspects of special operations with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, but she'd never quite cracked the code of belonging. After her morning runs, Elena would spend 30 minutes in her barracks room practicing a form of emotional camouflage. She'd stand before the mirror mounted on her wall locker and rehearse facial expressions, testing different combinations of confidence and deference until she found the precise balance that kept her invisible to unwanted attention. Too confident, and she was labeled arrogant. Too deferential, and she was seen as weak. The narrow path between those extremes required constant navigation. Her room was a study in controlled minimalism. A single photograph of Miguel in his dress blues sat on her desk, flanked by technical manuals she read like scripture. Her awards and commendations were filed away in a drawer rather than displayed. Visible achievement drew scrutiny she couldn't afford. The only personal touch was a small succulent plant her mother had given her during her last visit, its stubborn persistence in the face of neglect serving as a daily reminder that survival sometimes required radical self-sufficiency. Elena had developed elaborate mental exercises to manage the cognitive dissonance of her situation. She would imagine herself as an undercover operative, infiltrating an organization that would never fully accept her presence. The framework allowed her to maintain emotional distance from the daily microaggressions and casual dismissals that might otherwise have destroyed her resolve. But the emotional cost was accumulating like compound interest. She'd notice herself flinching at unexpected sounds, her startled response heightened by months of hypervigilance. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams where she proved herself over and over again to audiences that vanished the moment she succeeded. Her appetite fluctuated wildly between periods of stress eating and complete disinterest in food. The contradictions in Elena's character ran deeper than professional camouflage. She could disassemble and rebuild an M4 carbine blindfolded in under 2 minutes, but she'd spent an hour in Target the previous weekend, paralyzed by choices between laundry detergents. She could navigate hostile urban terrain using nothing but intuition and experience. But simple social interactions left her feeling exposed and uncertain that her kindness manifested in unexpected ways. Elena had quietly covered the emergency room bills for Private Martinez's daughter when his insurance fell through. She'd tutored struggling soldiers in marksmanship during her off-duty hours, never taking credit for their improved scores. When Sergeant Peterson's wife left him, Elena had shown up at his apartment with groceries and silence, understanding that some wounds required presence rather than words. These acts of service weren't strategic moves designed to build alliances. They were expressions of an empathy she couldn't quite suppress despite its professional disadvantages. Elena genuinely cared about the people who dismissed her capabilities, which made their eventual betrayal all the more devastating. Her dreams extended beyond military service, though she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge them fully, in quiet. Moments she imagined teaching tactical training to police academies, translating her hard-won expertise into civilian applications. She'd sketched out business plans for a private security consulting firm, one that would prioritize competence over connections. But these aspirations felt as distant as other planets, accessible only through decades of proving herself in an environment designed to find her wanting. Elena's relationship with fear was complex and evolving. Physical danger held no particular terror for her. Bullets and explosives were honest threats that could be analyzed and countered through training and equipment. But the fear of professional irrelevance, of being dismissed as a diversity hire or social experiment, had burrowed into her psyche like a parasite feeding on her confidence. The morning General Caldwell delivered his verdict. Elena had arrived at the briefing room 15 minutes early. She'd chosen her uniform with particular care, ensuring every detail met regulation standards. Her boots were polished to mirror brightness, her ribbons arranged in perfect order, her hair secured in a regulation bun that wouldn't give anyone excuse to question her professionalism. The briefing room itself was a temple to military hierarchy, its walls decorated with unit history and commendations dating back decades. Elena had studied every photograph, memorizing the faces of soldiers who had earned their place through combat rather than politics. She'd imagined her own photograph joining their ranks someday, a visual testament to persistence rewarding merit. But as her 23 colleagues filed into the room, Elena had felt the familiar weight of being simultaneously visible and invisible. Visible as the sole woman in a male-dominated space, invisible as an individual whose contributions mattered less than her symbolic presence. She'd perfected the art of appearing engaged while mentally cataloging every micro-expression, every exchanged glance that might reveal the day's agenda. General Caldwell's entrance had changed the room's atmospheric pressure. He commanded attention through sheer force of personality, his presence filling spaces in ways that couldn't be taught or faked. Elena had studied his leadership style with the intensity of a graduate student, noting how he used humor to build rapport, how he modulated his voice to emphasize critical points, how he made eye contact with specific individuals to communicate approval or disapproval. The general's assessment had been delivered with clinical precision, as if Elena were a piece of equipment being evaluated for replacement rather than a human being whose identity was inextricably linked to her service record. Specialist Voss demonstrates technical proficiency in required skill sets. He'd begun, his tone suggesting that technical proficiency was somehow insufficient for actual combat operations. Elena had felt herself fragmenting as the words continued, part of her mind recording every detail for later analysis while another part began constructing emotional walls that would protect whatever remained of her professional identity. The room had grown smaller with each sentence, the air thinner, until she felt like she was drowning in plain sight of people who had once trusted her with their lives. The recommendation for reassignment to logistics had been the final stroke, as precisely delivered as a sniper's bullet. Elena had maintained her composure through pure force of will, nodding at appropriate moments and maintaining eye contact even as her world collapsed around her. But inside, something fundamental had shifted, like a seismic fault line, finally releasing decades of accumulated pressure. The subsequent applause had been the most humiliating sound she'd ever heard. Each clap a hammer blow against whatever remained of her faith in institutional fairness. 23 men who had shared foxholes and mess halls with her, celebrating her removal from their ranks as if she were a tumor being excised from healthy tissue. Elena had walked out of that briefing room with her spine straight and her expression neutral, but she'd left something essential behind: trust, hope, the belief that excellence would eventually triumph over prejudice. In their place, something colder and more calculating had taken root, growing stronger with each passing day until it culminated in tonight's rain-soaked reckoning. The woman sitting in the commissary that morning, had been capable of forgiveness, even of those who had wronged her. The woman now hunting Dutch Kowalski through shadows and rust had evolved beyond such limitations. Evolution, after all, was simply another word for survival. And 2 weeks after General Caldwell's pronouncement, Elena sat in Major Williams's office listening to the administrative details of her reassignment with the detached fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Major Williams was a career bureaucrat who had perfected the art of delivering bad news with sympathetic efficiency. His office walls displayed certificates from leadership seminars and staff college programs, credentials that qualified him to destroy careers with proper documentation and appropriate emotional labor. He'd adjusted his reading glasses 3 times while reviewing Elena's transfer orders, a nervous habit that revealed his discomfort with the conversation subtext. Your new assignment with the 42nd Logistics Battalion represents an excellent opportunity for professional development, Major Williams had said, his voice carrying the hollow enthusiasm of someone reciting corporate speaking points. Colonel Martinez specifically requested your expertise for their upcoming modernization initiative. Elena had translated this bureaucratic poetry into plain English. They were exiling her to a support unit where her special operations training would rust away like abandoned equipment. The 42nd Logistics Battalion was where careers went to die. Quietly, far from the operational spotlight that defined military relevance. She would spend her remaining service years managing supply chains and inventory reports instead of executing missions that mattered. The first injustice had arrived disguised as administrative oversight. Somehow, Elena's security clearance had been flagged for review during the transfer process, temporarily suspending her access to classified material. This meant she couldn't participate in mission planning or access intelligence briefings that had been routine parts of her daily work. She'd become a ghost haunting her former life, present but powerless. Staff Sergeant Morrison had delivered this news with the casual indifference of someone discussing cafeteria menu changes. Morrison, who had trusted her to cover his flanks during 3 combat deployments, now spoke to her like she was a potential security risk. The transformation was so complete, it felt like science fiction. Body snatchers replacing people she'd known with hollow duplicates who shared their faces but none of their humanity. Captain Hayes had engineered the second injustice with particular cruelty. Elena's departure from the unit required transferring her ongoing training responsibilities to other personnel, including a marksmanship program she'd developed to improve unit accuracy scores. Hayes had assigned this program to Sergeant Kowalski. Despite Dutch's mediocre shooting scores and complete lack of instructional experience, Dutch brings a different perspective to the role, Hayes had explained when Elena questioned the decision. Sometimes fresh eyes can improve established programs. The insult was surgical in its precision, implying that Elena's expertise was somehow stagnant, that her proven methods needed improvement from someone demonstrably less qualified. Elena had watched Dutch conduct her first marksmanship session from across the training range, observing as he ignored her carefully developed curriculum in favor of generic drills pulled from outdated field manuals. The soldiers struggled with techniques that Elena could have corrected in minutes, their frustration visible in their body language and declining performance scores. But pointing this out would only confirm her reputation as someone unable to accept change. The third injustice had been more subtle, but perhaps more damaging. Elena's outstanding performance review, already completed and approved by her immediate supervisors, had mysteriously disappeared from her personnel file. In its place was a supplementary evaluation that emphasized areas needing improvement rather than strengths demonstrated during actual combat operations. Lieutenant Chun had discovered this bureaucratic sleight of hand while helping Elena review her transfer paperwork. Sarah's normally calm demeanor had cracked as she compared the original documents with their replacements, her face flushing with an anger that Elena couldn't afford to share publicly. "This is criminal," Sarah had whispered, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. Your Afghanistan performance alone should guarantee any assignment you want. Instead, they're rewriting history to justify their decision. Elena had felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest as she read the supplementary evaluation. It described a soldier who needed constant supervision, who struggled with independent decision-making, who showed concerning signs of emotional instability under pressure. Every strength had been reframed as a weakness, every achievement diminished through careful word choice and selective omission. The fourth injustice had arrived through Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the unit's senior enlisted advisor and Elena's former mentor. Rodriguez had built his reputation on straight talk and fierce advocacy for his soldiers, qualities that made his betrayal particularly devastating. He'd cornered Elena in the equipment storage room, away from curious observers, to deliver what he called hard truths about military reality. "You're a good soldier, Voss," Rodriguez had said, his weathered face expressing something that might have been genuine sympathy. "But good isn't good enough at this level. You need to understand that some battles can't be won through individual excellence. Sometimes the smartest thing is accepting reality and moving on." Rodriguez's words had struck Elena like physical blows, each sentence dismantling another piece of her faith in meritocracy. This was the man who had taught her advanced tactical planning, who had recommended her for specialized training programs, who had praised her adaptability and quick thinking in combat situations. Now he stood before her advocating surrender. As if principled resistance was somehow naive, the fifth injustice had been orchestrated by Dutch Kowalski himself, though Elena wouldn't understand its full scope until much later. Dutch had systematically poisoned her reputation through carefully constructed conversations with other unit members, spreading doubt about her mental stability and commitment to team cohesion. His approach was masterful in its subtlety, never directly attacking Elena's competence, but consistently raising questions about her attitude and team chemistry. Elena had begun noticing the effects of this campaign in the changed dynamics of routine interactions. Soldiers who had previously sought her advice on technical matters now avoided her completely. Training partners who had competed good-naturedly with her marksmanship scores suddenly became distant and formal. The easy camaraderie that had sustained her through difficult deployments evaporated like desert moisture under an unforgiving sun. The sixth injustice had targeted her personal relationships outside the unit. Somehow, Elena's civilian contacts had begun receiving inquiries about her emotional stability and potential security risks. Her mother had called worried and confused after being contacted by someone claiming to investigate Elena's fitness for continued military service. Former high school friends had mentioned strange phone calls asking about Elena's past behavior and political associations. Elena recognized this as psychological warfare designed to isolate her from external support networks. By raising questions about her stability among civilian contacts, her enemies were ensuring she had nowhere to turn for perspective or emotional refuge. It was a brilliant strategy that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and institutional power dynamics. The seventh injustice had been perhaps the most personally devastating. Elena's request for emergency leave to attend Miguel's memorial service, the formal ceremony commemorating the first anniversary of his death, had been denied due to operational requirements. There were no actual operational requirements. The unit was between deployments and conducting routine training exercises. But Major Williams had cited security concerns and administrative complications as justification for keeping Elena on base during what should have been a sacred family obligation. Elena had stood in Major Williams's office absorbing this final humiliation with the stunned disbelief of someone watching their world burn. Miguel's memorial service had been planned for months, coordinated with his former unit and their parents' work schedules. Elena's absence would be noticed and discussed, adding another layer of shame to her growing collection of professional failures. But the true injury wasn't logistical, it was symbolic. By preventing Elena from honoring her brother's memory, they had attacked the foundation of her military service. Miguel had inspired her to join the army, to seek assignment to elite units, to measure herself against the highest possible standards. Denying her this final gesture of respect was like vandalizing a grave. The eighth injustice had arrived through Colonel Peterson, the base commander whose signature was required on Elena's transfer orders. Peterson had summoned her for what was described as a courtesy conversation, but quickly devolved into a lecture about accepting reality and managing expectations. His office was decorated with photographs from successful operations he'd commanded, visual evidence of the authority underlying his words. Military service requires subordinating individual desires to collective needs, Peterson had said, his tone suggesting he was imparting profound wisdom rather than stating obvious platitudes. Your resistance to this reassignment suggests a concerning focus on personal advancement over unit cohesion. Elena had realized during this conversation that her opponents had successfully reframed her situation. Instead of being a capable soldier, unfairly removed from her position, she was now characterized as a malcontent whose selfishness threatened unit morale. The narrative had been completely inverted, transforming victim into villain through careful manipulation of perspective and selective presentation of facts. The ninth injustice had been delivered by General Caldwell himself during Elena's final unit formation. He had used her reassignment as a teaching moment for the remaining soldiers, explaining how difficult personnel decisions sometimes required prioritizing mission effectiveness over individual preferences. His words had been chosen carefully to avoid legal liability while maximizing psychological impact. Special operations demands absolute trust between team members, Caldwell had announced to the assembled formation. When that trust is compromised, we must make difficult decisions to preserve unit effectiveness. Specialist Voss's reassignment reflects our commitment to maintaining the highest operational standards. Elena had stood at attention during this speech, her face betraying nothing while her mind cataloged every word for future reference. Caldwell was publicly branding her as someone who had compromised unit trust, creating an official narrative that would follow her throughout her remaining military service. He was destroying her reputation not just within their unit, but across the entire special operations community. The formation had concluded with standard military pageantry, but Elena had felt like she was attending her own funeral. Her colleagues' faces reflected a mixture of relief and awkward sympathy, emotions that confirmed her transformation from insider to outsider was now complete and irreversible. As Elena packed her personal items from the team room that evening, the weight of accumulated injustices had finally crystallized into something harder and more purposeful than mere anger. She'd been systematically betrayed by every person whose opinion mattered to her professional identity. They had questioned her competence, destroyed her reputation, isolated her from support systems, and finally prevented her from honoring her brother's memory. But they had made one critical error in their campaign of professional assassination. They had underestimated Elena's capacity for adaptation, her ability to evolve beyond their expectations and definitions. They saw her as a problem to be managed through administrative channels and bureaucratic maneuvering. They didn't recognize her as a predator whose hunting instincts were now focused on them. 23 men had participated in Elena's professional destruction. 23 soldiers who had forgotten that the woman they dismissed as useless was trained by the same institution that had trained them, equipped with the same lethal skills, and now motivated by something more powerful than duty or patriotism. Tonight, in this rain-soaked warehouse, Elena would remind them all why she had earned her place among their ranks. The lesson would be delivered with surgical precision, one elimination at a time, until the last of her tormentors understood the true cost of their casual cruelty. The first revelation came to Elena as she crouched behind container 15F, watching Dutch Kowalski's tactical light swept through the darkness 40 meters away. His movement patterns were too predictable, following textbook urban warfare protocols that assumed his adversary was untrained or desperate. But as Elena observed, his methodical approach, a more disturbing truth crystallized in her mind like frost on morning glass. This wasn't panic behavior. Dutch was hunting her with the same cold professionalism she had used to eliminate his 22 colleagues. More unsettling still, his positioning suggested intimate knowledge of her preferred tactics and psychological profile. Someone had briefed him on her methods, prepared him for exactly this scenario. The warehouse's emergency lighting cast everything in harsh relief, creating a chiaroscuro landscape of absolute shadows and blinding brightness. Elena's position gave her visual superiority, but Dutch's confidence suggested he possessed advantages she hadn't yet identified. She thought back through the evening's eliminations, searching for patterns that might explain his apparent composure. Staff Sergeant Morrison's death had been clean and efficient, but now Elena wondered if it had been too easy. Morrison was paranoid by nature, the kind of soldier who checked corners twice and never relaxed his guard, even in secure environments. Yet he'd stepped out for that cigarette break with his back turned to potential threats, as if he was expecting to be alone, as if someone had told him the area was secure. The second revelation struck with the force of divine lightning. Elena's anonymous tip about the warehouse celebration hadn't been anonymous at all. Someone with access to classified communication systems had fed her information about tonight's gathering, information that could only have come from within the intelligence community. She'd been manipulated into this confrontation as surely as her targets had been lured to their deaths. Elena's mind raced through the implications. If tonight was orchestrated rather than organic, then someone wanted these 23 men dead. Someone with enough authority to access personnel files, communication logs, and operational intelligence. Someone who could coordinate a complex psychological operation designed to turn Elena into an unwitting weapon, but who would benefit from eliminating an entire special operations team. And why use Elena as the instrument of their destruction? Dutch's voice cut through her analysis. I know what you're thinking, Elena. You're realizing this whole thing was set up from the beginning. You're wondering who's been pulling the strings. His words confirmed her suspicions while raising new and more terrifying questions. Dutch wasn't just the last target on her list. He was somehow connected to the forces that had orchestrated tonight's massacre. Elena adjusted her position, using a polished steel surface to observe his location without exposing herself to potential sniper fire. Want to know the really beautiful part? Dutch continued, his voice carrying across the warehouse with theatrical clarity. You did exactly what they predicted you'd do. Every move, every elimination, every tactical decision played out like a script they wrote specifically for you. The third revelation arrived with the weight of crushing inevitability. Elena's psychological profile, developed during years of military service and psychological evaluations, would have provided a perfect blueprint for predicting her response to systematic humiliation and betrayal. Someone had used her own personality against her, weaponizing her pride and sense of justice to transform her into an efficient killing machine. Elena thought back to her meetings with Dr. Sarah Hendricks, the unit psychologist who had conducted routine mental health assessments. Those sessions, which Elena had approached as professional obligations, had actually been intelligence-gathering operations designed to map her psychological vulnerabilities and behavioral triggers. Every childhood trauma, every personal fear, every aspirational goal had been cataloged and analyzed for potential exploitation. The warehouse suddenly felt less like a hunting ground and more like a laboratory where Elena was both predator and experimental subject. But if tonight was an elaborate psychological experiment, what hypothesis were they testing? And what conclusions were they hoping to draw from 23 dead soldiers and one potentially expendable operative? Dutch had moved closer while Elena processed these realizations, his tactical light now probing the shadows near her position. But his approach lacked the urgency of someone genuinely hunting a dangerous fugitive. Instead, his movement suggested the patience of someone following a predetermined timeline, waiting for Elena to reach specific psychological checkpoints before revealing the next layer of deception. "You're wondering about General Caldwell, aren't you?" Dutch's voice carried a note of genuine amusement. "Wondering why he was so eager to destroy your career when your performance record was spotless. Wondering why a man who built his reputation on recognizing talent suddenly couldn't see yours." Elena's blood turned to ice water in her veins. General Caldwell's inexplicable hostility toward her had been the linchpin of her professional destruction, the single decision that had cascaded into tonight's bloodbath. But if Dutch possessed insider knowledge about Caldwell's motivations, then the conspiracy extended far beyond a simple case of military sexism or institutional bias. The fourth revelation emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution, slowly revealing details that transformed her understanding of recent events. General Caldwell hadn't been acting on personal prejudice or professional judgment when he recommended her reassignment. He'd been following orders from someone higher in the chain of command, someone who needed Elena removed from her position, for reasons that had nothing to do with her competence or unit cohesion, but who possessed enough authority to manipulate a general's personnel decisions. And why was Elena's presence in the 7th Special Operations Division suddenly considered problematic by forces beyond the military hierarchy? "The Defense Intelligence Agency has been watching you for a long time, Elena," Dutch said, answering questions she hadn't yet fully formulated. "Ever since that incident in Syria where you improvised a solution to rescue those hostages. Your creativity under pressure impressed some very important people, but it also scared them." Elena remembered Syria with painful clarity. Their original extraction plan had fallen apart when intelligence reports proved inaccurate and local militia forces had repositioned themselves around the target building, while her teammates had followed protocol and requested new orders from command. Elena had identified an alternative approach using civilian infrastructure and improvised equipment. Her solution had saved 6 American contractors who would have died waiting for official authorization to proceed. But apparently, her success had marked her as someone capable of independent thinking in situations where independent thinking might be inconvenient for certain institutional interests. The irony was breathtaking. She was being punished for exactly the kind of adaptability and resourcefulness that special operations units were supposed to value above all else. "They needed you out of the unit before the Morocco operation," Dutch continued, his tactical light now stationary, as if he'd found a comfortable position for this extended conversation. "Can't have someone around who might ask inconvenient questions about classified mission parameters or refuse orders that contradict established rules of engagement." The 5th revelation struck Elena like a physical blow. The Morocco deployment that had been used to justify her reassignment wasn't a legitimate special operations mission at all. It was something darker, something that required operatives who would follow orders without questioning their legality or moral implications. Her reputation for ethical behavior and independent judgment had made her a liability for whatever activities were planned in North Africa. Elena's mind reeled as she considered the implications. If the Morocco operation involved activities that couldn't withstand scrutiny from ethical soldiers, then her entire unit was being prepared for war crimes or covert operations that violated international law. Her removal wasn't about competence, it was about plausible deniability. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the DIA wanted her away from the unit, why orchestrate tonight's massacre? Why eliminate the very soldiers they had supposedly prepared for their illegal mission? "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" Dutch's voice carried a note of genuine respect. The Morocco operation was never real. It was just cover for removing you from the unit without raising suspicions. But your replacement created new problems that required more permanent solutions. The sixth revelation hit Elena with the force of a seismic shift. Tonight's warehouse gathering hadn't been a celebration of her departure. It had been a farewell party for soldiers who had learned too much about their superiors' activities. Someone had decided that 23 special operations personnel represented a security risk that could only be managed through elimination. Elena felt sick as she understood her role in this conspiracy. She wasn't a wronged soldier seeking personal revenge. She was an unwitting assassin, manipulated into eliminating witnesses who might have exposed classified criminal activities. Every death tonight had been a service to conspirators who remained safely anonymous, while she absorbed legal and moral responsibility for their actions. But Dutch's survival suggested he wasn't just another witness to be eliminated. His knowledge of the conspiracy's details indicated he was either a participant or a handler, someone trusted with information that had been kept from his colleagues. That made him either her controller or her final target, depending on how this elaborate game was designed to conclude. The beautiful thing about using you as our instrument is that everyone will believe the official story, Dutch said, his voice carrying across the warehouse with the confidence of someone revealing a completed puzzle. Unstable female soldier snaps under pressure, kills her former teammates in revenge fantasy gone wrong. Case closed, investigation concluded. No awkward questions about what those soldiers might have known or reported. Elena's hands trembled with rage as the full scope of her manipulation became clear. She'd been transformed into a cover story for institutional murder, her genuine grievances weaponized to provide plausible motivation for eliminating potential whistleblowers. Worse still, her psychological profile had been so thoroughly analyzed that her handlers could predict her responses with mathematical precision. The seventh revelation was perhaps the most personally devastating. Miguel's death in Afghanistan hadn't been the random tragedy she'd believed. Elena accessed encrypted files in her memory, details about his final mission that had never quite made sense. Miguel had been investigating irregularities in weapons, shipments to local militia forces, discrepancies that might have exposed arms trafficking by American intelligence agencies. Your brother was getting too close to some very expensive secrets, Dutch confirmed, as if reading her thoughts. Had to be removed before he could file his report. The IED that killed him was triggered remotely, not by pressure plate like the official investigation concluded. Elena felt something fundamental break inside her chest, a structural failure that released decades of carefully controlled emotion. They had murdered Miguel to protect their criminal operations, then used his death to heighten her emotional vulnerability for tonight's manipulation. Her brother's memory had been desecrated twice, once by his killers, and again by those who used his death as a psychological weapon against her. But understanding the conspiracy's scope also revealed its weaknesses. If Dutch possessed detailed knowledge of these operations, then eliminating him would remove a key witness to multiple criminal activities. More importantly, if Elena could survive tonight and expose what she'd learned, she might be able to seek justice for Miguel's murder and prevent future victims from suffering similar fates. The eighth revelation crystallized as Elena analyzed Dutch's behavior patterns. He was stalling for time, engaging in detailed exposition that served no tactical purpose unless he was waiting for something specific to occur. Either reinforcements were en route, or this entire conversation was being recorded to provide evidence supporting the official narrative of her mental breakdown. Elena checked her tactical watch, 0412 hours. Dawn was still hours away, but sunrise would bring investigators, crime scene technicians, and media coverage that would transform tonight's events into tomorrow's headlines. If Dutch was delaying until daylight, then his handlers wanted her captured alive to provide additional credibility for their cover story. But Elena had one advantage her manipulators hadn't anticipated. Her psychological profile had been developed during routine mental health assessments and debriefings, when she was still committed to following institutional rules and maintaining professional relationships. The woman who had entered this warehouse tonight was fundamentally different from the soldier whose behavior patterns they thought they could predict. 3 months of systematic betrayal had burned away her faith in institutional authority, her commitment to following orders, and her willingness to accept injustice for the sake of unit cohesion. They had created exactly the kind of unpredictable adversary their conspiracy was designed to avoid. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Elena smiled in the darkness as she realized that Dutch's confidence might be misplaced. Yes, she had eliminated 23 targets exactly as predicted. But her handlers had made a critical error in assuming that understanding their manipulation would paralyze her with despair rather than liberate her to improvise beyond their expectations. The 9th revelation was tactical rather than strategic. Dutch's position near Container 23A placed him directly beneath a structural weakness Elena had identified during her initial reconnaissance. The warehouse's roof support system had been damaged by years of weather exposure, creating a section where sufficient impact could trigger a partial collapse. If Elena could maneuver Dutch into the correct position, she might be able to eliminate him while creating enough chaos to escape before his backup arrived. But first, she needed to extract one final piece of information from him. If tonight was designed as a cleanup operation, then other witnesses might still be alive and vulnerable. Elena thought about Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who had discovered the altered performance reviews. Sarah's friendship with Elena made her a potential liability for the conspiracy, someone who might ask uncomfortable questions about tonight's events. What about Sarah Chun? Elena called out, her voice carefully modulated to project desperation, rather than tactical planning. Is she part of this, or is she next on your list? Dutch's pause before responding told Elena everything she needed to know. Sarah was still alive, but her survival depended on variables that extended beyond tonight's immediate objectives. The conspiracy was designed to continue eliminating threats as they emerged, using Elena's apparent breakdown as justification for investigating and removing anyone who might support her claims of institutional persecution. Elena felt the familiar weight of protective instinct settling over her like armor. Sarah had been genuinely loyal throughout Elena's professional destruction, risking her own career to provide emotional support and practical assistance. If Elena could survive tonight and warn Sarah about the danger she faced, she might be able to save at least one innocent person from the conspiracy's expanding reach. But survival required finishing what she'd started. Dutch Kowalski represented the final link between tonight's massacre and the broader criminal conspiracy that had orchestrated it. His death would complete her mission while denying his handlers a key witness and operational asset. Elena began moving toward the warehouse's structural weak point, using shadows and container placement to mask her approach. Dutch's tactical light continued sweeping the area where she'd been positioned, suggesting he hadn't yet detected her movement. His overconfidence would be his final mistake, the predictable human error that would complete tonight's bloody equation. 23 targets eliminated. One more to go. But now Elena understood that tonight's mission extended beyond personal revenge. It was about preventing future victims and honoring the memory of everyone who had been sacrificed to protect institutional criminality. The warehouse groaned under the weight of accumulating rain as Elena prepared to deliver justice disguised as vengeance. Dutch Kowalski would die believing he was the victim of an unstable woman's breakdown, never understanding that his death was actually the first blow struck in a war he thought his side had already won. The 10th revelation came as Elena reached her intended position beneath the damaged roof supports. Dutch's tactical light had found traces of her previous location, scuff marks in the dust, a few drops of blood from her wounded ribs, evidence that confirmed her presence while revealing nothing about her current position. But his examination of these clues was too thorough, too methodical for someone operating under time pressure. Dutch wasn't just hunting her. He was documenting her movements for post-incident analysis. Every tactical decision she'd made tonight was being recorded and evaluated, not for immediate use but for future reference. Elena realized with crystalline clarity that she was participating in a field test of psychological manipulation techniques, her responses providing valuable data for refining similar operations against future targets. The warehouse had become a laboratory where human beings were reduced to experimental subjects, their deaths serving as data points in some classified research program. Elena thought about the soldiers she'd eliminated tonight, wondering how many of them had been genuine targets versus convenient test subjects, whose deaths would provide useful information about combat psychology and operational planning. "You're wondering about the bigger picture now," Dutch said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone watching a carefully constructed plan reach its culmination. "Wondering how many other operations like this have been conducted, how many soldiers have been manipulated into eliminating their own teammates for the greater good of national security." Elena felt the weight of infinite possibilities pressing down on her like oceanic depths. If tonight's operation was part of a broader program, then similar manipulations might be occurring throughout the military, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement. How many workplace shootings and domestic terrorism incidents were actually sophisticated psychological operations designed to eliminate inconvenient witnesses or test behavioral modification techniques? The 11th revelation struck her as she observed Dutch's positioning relative to the structural weak point she'd identified. He was deliberately avoiding the area where roof collapse would be most likely, as if he possessed detailed knowledge of the warehouse's engineering specifications. Someone had briefed him on potential tactical opportunities Elena might attempt to exploit, including her tendency to use environmental factors as force multipliers. But if Dutch knew about the roof weakness, then Elena's planned assault would fail catastrophically. She needed to adapt her approach, finding alternatives that hadn't been anticipated by whoever had analyzed her tactical preferences. The challenge was identifying blind spots in psychological profiles that seemed to predict her behavior with supernatural accuracy. Elena began reviewing everything she knew about psychological profiling methodology, searching for variables that might have been overlooked or underweighted in her assessment. Most personality analysis focused on observable behaviors and stated preferences, but it struggled to account for evolution under extreme stress or the emergence of capabilities that hadn't been previously tested. The 12th revelation emerged as Elena considered her current emotional state. 3 months ago, she would have prioritized legal resolution over violent retribution, seeking justice through official channels even when those channels seemed compromised. But tonight, she had crossed moral boundaries that would have been unthinkable during her previous psychological evaluations. Her handlers had based their predictions on historical data that no longer reflected her current reality. They were fighting a ghost, the Elena Voss, who had existed before her systematic betrayal by every institution and individual she'd trusted. The woman who now stalked Dutch through shadows and rust was a new creation, forged by trauma and tempered by loss. Elena smiled grimly as she realized the fundamental flaw in her opponent's approach. Psychological profiles were static documents that assumed consistent personality traits over time. But human beings were dynamic systems capable of radical transformation under sufficient pressure. Tonight's Elena was operating beyond the boundaries of her documented psychological parameters. Dutch's confidence was based on obsolete intelligence, like a general fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's tactics. Elena had evolved beyond his understanding, adapted beyond his predictions, and now possessed advantages that couldn't be quantified through standardized assessment tools. "Time to finish this, Elena," Dutch called out, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested external pressure to conclude tonight's operation. You've played your part perfectly, but the curtain's coming down whether you're ready or not. Elena heard the subtle change in his tone that indicated transition from psychological manipulation to direct action. Dutch was moving beyond conversation toward elimination, probably under orders to conclude her mission before dawn, brought unwanted attention to the warehouse. But his urgency created opportunities for someone willing to improvise beyond established tactical doctrine. Elena abandoned her original plan and began moving toward Container 41C, a position that offered multiple escape routes while maintaining visual contact with Dutch's likely approach vectors. Her movements were now guided by intuition rather than training, improvisation rather than procedure. She was writing new tactical doctrine in real time, creating patterns that couldn't be predicted because they didn't previously exist. The warehouse's emergency lighting created a complex maze of shadows and reflections that shifted with every small movement of the overhead fixtures. Elena used this visual chaos to mask her approach, moving when shadow patterns provided optimal concealment and freezing when light shifts might reveal her position. She had become one with the environment in ways that transcended technical training. Dutch's tactical light swept through her previous position, confirming her successful relocation. But his search pattern revealed frustration and growing concern, emotions that suggested his handlers hadn't prepared him for extended pursuit of an adaptive adversary. Elena was forcing him to operate beyond his comfort zone, creating stress that would degrade his decision-making capabilities. The 13th revelation crystallized as Elena reached her new position. Dutch wasn't just a participant in tonight's conspiracy, he was also expendable. His detailed knowledge of classified operations made him a liability that would eventually require elimination, probably through an accident or suicide that occurred after Elena's official capture or death. He was playing a role in his own eventual destruction, too blinded by immediate authority to recognize his long-term expendability. Elena felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for Dutch, despite everything he had done to orchestrate her professional destruction. He genuinely believed he was serving legitimate national security interests, following orders from superiors whose judgment he trusted implicitly. His betrayal of Elena and their colleagues wasn't motivated by personal malice, but by institutional loyalty that had been weaponized against him. But sympathy couldn't override necessity. Dutch's death was required not just to complete Elena's revenge, but to protect future victims from similar manipulation. His elimination would disrupt whatever operational timeline his handlers were following while denying them a skilled asset for future psychological operations. Elena checked her ammunition, 3 rounds remaining in her current magazine, plus 2 spare magazines containing 15 rounds each. Sufficient firepower to conclude tonight's mission, assuming she could maintain tactical superiority through positioning and initiative. But Dutch was also well-armed and professionally trained, making direct confrontation potentially costly. 14th revelation arrived as Elena observed Dutch's movement toward her previous position. He was following predictable search patterns based on standard urban warfare doctrine, methodically clearing potential hiding spots without adapting to the specific tactical environment. His training was limiting his effectiveness rather than enhancing it, creating vulnerabilities that a more flexible adversary could exploit. Elena realized that her entire military education had been designed to create soldiers who followed established procedures rather than thinking independently. But tonight's circumstances demanded innovation beyond institutional parameters, creativity that could only emerge when survival depended on transcending official doctrine. Her systematic betrayal by military authority had inadvertently liberated her from the very limitations that now constrained Dutch's tactical options. The warehouse stretched before Elena like a 3-dimensional chessboard where every container and shadow represented potential moves in a game whose rules were being written through violence. She could see patterns and possibilities that hadn't existed when she was constrained by regulations and standard operating procedures. Tonight, she was fighting as herself rather than as a representative of institutional authority. Dutch's tactical light probed the darkness near Container 35B, approximately 60 meters from Elena's current position. His methodical approach would bring him within effective range in roughly 4 minutes, assuming he maintained current movement speed and search patterns. Elena used this time to prepare her final positioning, ensuring multiple backup plans for whatever tactical surprises might emerge during their concluding confrontation. But first, she needed to extract one final piece of information that might prove crucial for protecting Sarah Chun and exposing the broader conspiracy. Elena needed to know how extensive the psychological operations program was, how many other soldiers might be targeted for similar manipulation, and what institutional safeguards existed to prevent future victims. "Dutch," Elena called out, her voice carrying across the warehouse with carefully calculated vulnerability. "Before this ends, I need to know something. How many others are there? How many soldiers have been used like I was used?" His pause before responding confirmed that Elena's question had struck close to sensitive information. The scope of the psychological operations program was apparently classified at levels that extended beyond Dutch's security clearance, making him another partially informed participant rather than a fully briefed insider. "More than you might think," Dutch finally replied, his voice carrying undertones of uncertainty that hadn't been present during his earlier revelations. "Less than you might fear. This kind of operation requires significant resources and careful target selection. Not something that can be implemented on a large scale." Elena translated this bureaucratic language into operational intelligence. The psychological manipulation program was active and ongoing, but limited by resource constraints and operational security requirements. That suggested a small number of highly trained handlers working with selected assets rather than a massive institutional program affecting thousands of soldiers. But even a small program represented an enormous threat to military integrity and individual rights. If Elena could survive tonight and expose what she'd learned, she might be able to prevent future operations while seeking justice for past victims. Dutch's death would be the first step in a larger campaign to dismantle the institutional machinery that had destroyed her life and Miguel's memory. Elena prepared for her final approach, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether tonight's mission concluded with justice or simply added another victim to an already extensive list. 23 targets eliminated, one more to go. But now the stakes extended far beyond personal revenge. They encompassed the integrity of institutions that claimed to serve democracy while practicing the darkest forms of authoritarianism. The Conde warehouse groaned under the weight of wind and rain as Elena moved toward her destiny, each step carrying her closer to either vindication or destruction. Dutch Kowalski would die tonight, but his death would serve purposes that extended far beyond Elena's personal satisfaction. It would be the first blow struck against forces that had forgotten the difference between serving their country and betraying everything their country was supposed to represent. The final confrontation unfolded with the brutal efficiency of a surgical procedure performed without anesthesia. Elena's approach from Container 41C had been perfectly executed, using reflective surfaces and shadow patterns to mask her movement until she achieved optimal positioning. Dutch's tactical light swept past her location twice without detecting her presence, confirming that her adaptation beyond predictable patterns had rendered his intelligence advantages obsolete. When Elena emerged from concealment 15 meters behind Dutch's position, her Glock was already trained on the base of his skull with the precision of a master craftsman. The distinctive sound of a weapon being chambered echoed through the warehouse like a death knell, freezing Dutch in position as he realized his tactical superiority had evaporated in an instant. "Drop your weapon," Elena commanded, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had transcended institutional limitations. Hands visible, movements slow and deliberate. Dutch complied with the mechanical precision of someone whose training had prepared him for this exact scenario, though his psychological preparation had clearly anticipated different power dynamics. As his rifle clattered against the concrete floor, Elena could see the moment when his carefully constructed confidence crumbled into the desperate calculations of a man facing imminent execution. "Turn around slowly," Elena continued, maintaining perfect sight alignment while Dutch rotated to face her. In the harsh emergency lighting, his face revealed a mixture of professional respect and genuine fear, emotions that humanized him in ways that complicated Elena's mission. Despite everything he had done to orchestrate her destruction, Dutch was still a soldier who had believed he was following legitimate orders from trusted superiors. "You understand that killing me won't change anything," Dutch said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "This operation extends beyond any individual participant. My death will simply result in my replacement by someone else, probably someone less sympathetic to your situation." Elena considered his words while maintaining tactical discipline. Dutch was attempting psychological manipulation even while facing execution, trying to plant seeds of doubt about the effectiveness of his elimination. But his argument contained logical flaws that revealed the limitations of his own understanding about the conspiracy's true scope and vulnerability. "Your death changes everything," Elena replied, her finger taking up slack in the trigger. "It removes a skilled asset from their operational roster while denying them a witness who could provide testimony supporting their cover story. More importantly, it sends a message that their psychological manipulation has consequences they didn't anticipate." The shot was perfectly placed, entering Dutch's skull at the base of the brainstem and causing instant cessation of all nervous system function. His body collapsed with the mechanical precision of a marionette whose strings had been cut, adding the 24th and final name to Elena's tally of tonight's eliminations. But Dutch's death marked the beginning rather than the conclusion of Elena's mission. As his body settled into final stillness, Elena felt the weight of accumulated knowledge pressing against her consciousness like floodwater behind a failing dam. 24 men dead, but their deaths were symptoms of a larger institutional cancer that required more comprehensive treatment. Elena methodically searched Dutch's body for intelligence material, finding encrypted communication devices and documentation. That confirmed her suspicions about the conspiracy's scope. The psychological operations program was indeed active and ongoing, with target lists that included dozens of military personnel across multiple branches and operational theaters. Elena's manipulation had been just one test case in a broader program designed to weaponize institutional authority against individual soldiers. The warehouse had become a crime scene that would attract federal investigation within hours of dawn. Elena used her remaining time to document everything she could about tonight's operation, photographing Dutch's intelligence materials and creating digital records that could be transmitted to journalists and congressional oversight committees. Her phone's encrypted messaging system allowed her to upload critical files to secure servers located outside government control. Lieutenant Sarah Chen received Elena's first message at 0434 hours. "Sarah, leave base immediately. They killed Miguel. Tonight was set up. We'll explain later. Trust no one in command structure. Stay alive." Elena's second message went to investigative journalist Marcus Rodriguez at the Washington Herald, a reporter known for exposing military corruption and intelligence agency overreach. The message contained Dutch's communication, logs and photographs of classified documents that would provide independent verification of Elena's claims about psychological manipulation programs. Her third message was directed to Congressman David Park, whose position on the House Intelligence Committee gave him oversight authority over military psychological operations. Elena attached detailed testimony about tonight's events, along with evidence supporting her allegations about Miguel's murder and institutional conspiracy to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. But documentation was only the first step in transforming tonight's violence into lasting institutional change. Elena needed to survive long enough for her revelations to receive proper investigation, which meant escaping the warehouse before Dutch's handlers realized their operation had failed. Catastrophically, Elena's extraction plan relied on infrastructure she'd identified during weeks of careful reconnaissance. Port Valencia's storm drainage system connected the warehouse district to civilian areas several miles away, providing concealed movement routes that couldn't be monitored through standard surveillance methods. She'd cached supplies and equipment at strategic points along this route, ensuring her ability to remain undetected for extended periods. The rain that had provided auditory cover during tonight's eliminations now served as Elena's ally during extraction. Storm drains filled with rushing water would mask her movement while washing away physical evidence that might otherwise guide pursuit teams to her location. She entered the drainage system through a maintenance access point behind Container 52A, disappearing into darkness that felt like salvation after hours of harsh warehouse lighting. Elena's journey through the storm drains took 3 hours of careful navigation through tunnels that smelled of rust and decay. Her waterproof equipment bags contained changes of clothing, civilian identification documents, and sufficient cash to remain independent of financial systems that could be monitored by government agencies. She emerged in a residential neighborhood 15 miles from the warehouse, looking like a jogger completing an early morning run rather than a fugitive fleeing multiple homicide scenes. The safe house Elena had prepared was a rented apartment, under an assumed identity, equipped with secure communication systems and multiple escape routes. She spent the next 48 hours monitoring news coverage of the warehouse discovery while coordinating with journalists and congressional investigators who were beginning to examine her evidence. Initial media reports characterized the warehouse massacre as a domestic terrorism incident perpetrated by an unstable former soldier seeking revenge against colleagues who had questioned her fitness for service. Elena watched these reports with grim satisfaction, recognizing the propaganda techniques her handlers were using to control public narrative, while deflecting attention from institutional corruption. But Elena's evidence was already spreading through channels that couldn't be controlled through standard government information management techniques. Marcus Rodriguez's initial story in the Washington Herald included enough documentation to establish credibility while protecting Elena's location and planned testimony. Congressional investigators had begun requesting classified files related to psychological operations programs, forcing government agencies to acknowledge programs they had previously denied existed. The first major breakthrough came 72 hours after the warehouse incident, when forensic analysis of Dutch's communication devices revealed connections to Defense Intelligence Agency personnel who had been conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on military personnel. Congressional oversight committees immediately launched investigations that expanded beyond Elena's specific case to examine broader patterns of institutional abuse. Elena's testimony to congressional investigators occurred in a secure facility, under conditions that protected her identity while allowing detailed examination of her allegations. She provided hour-by-hour documentation of her psychological manipulation, supported by physical evidence and digital records that confirmed her claims about institutional conspiracy to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The investigation's scope expanded rapidly as other victims of psychological manipulation came forward with similar stories. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos testified about being manipulated into eliminating suspected informants during operations in Iraq. Captain James Wheeler described psychological pressure campaigns designed to force his resignation after he reported war crimes committed by superior officers. Dozens of additional cases emerged as investigators examined classified psychological operations files. Elena's revelation about Miguel's murder triggered a separate investigation that ultimately exposed a massive arms trafficking conspiracy involving senior intelligence officials. Miguel's death had been orchestrated to prevent his testimony about weapons shipments to terrorist organizations, shipments that were generating illegal profits for corrupt government personnel. His murder was just one example of systematic elimination of witnesses who posed threats to criminal networks operating within government agencies. The institutional response to these revelations was swift and comprehensive. Congressional oversight. Committees recommended criminal prosecution for dozens of military and intelligence personnel involved in unauthorized psychological operations. The Defense Intelligence Agency underwent complete restructuring with new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuse of psychological manipulation techniques. Elena emerged from hiding 6 months after the warehouse incident to testify publicly about her experiences and advocate for institutional reforms that would protect future soldiers from similar manipulation. Her testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee was broadcast live on national television, transforming her from fugitive into reluctant symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. But Elena's most important legacy wasn't her public testimony or media attention. It was the network of support and protection she built for other victims of psychological manipulation. Working with Sarah Chun and other trusted allies, Elena established secure communication channels that allowed victims to report abuse without fear of retaliation. This network became instrumental in identifying and stopping psychological operations before they could cause additional casualties. Elena's relationship with Sarah Chun evolved from friendship into partnership as they collaborated on exposing institutional corruption. Sarah's position within the military provided insider access to intelligence that complemented Elena's external investigative capabilities. Together, they developed methodologies for identifying and documenting psychological manipulation programs that were being applied to other military personnel. The warehouse where Elena had eliminated 24 men was eventually demolished and replaced with a memorial park dedicated to soldiers who had died fighting institutional corruption. Elena attended the dedication ceremony as a private citizen, watching as families of her victims struggled to understand how their loved ones had become participants in criminal conspiracies. The memorial's design included individual plaques for each of the 24 soldiers, acknowledging their deaths while avoiding specific details about their involvement in psychological operations. Elena's personal healing occurred gradually through therapy sessions with Dr. Rachel Morrison, a civilian psychologist who specialized in treating trauma resulting from institutional betrayal. These sessions helped Elena process the psychological damage caused by systematic manipulation, while developing coping strategies for living with knowledge of government criminality that extended far beyond her personal experience. The silver locket containing Miguel's photograph remained Elena's constant companion, but its meaning evolved from painful reminder to symbol of justice achieved through sacrifice. Miguel's memory had been honored not just through exposing his killers, but through preventing similar deaths of other soldiers who might otherwise have become victims of institutional conspiracy. 2 years after the warehouse incident, Elena published a memoir titled Expendable Assets: How Military Psychology Programs Turn Soldiers Against Each Other. The book became a bestseller that educated civilian audiences about psychological manipulation techniques while providing practical guidance for military personnel facing similar pressure campaigns. Elena donated all proceeds to organizations supporting veterans who had experienced institutional betrayal. Elena's current life balanced public advocacy with private healing. She testified regularly before congressional committees examining military corruption while maintaining a low profile. Residence in rural Montana where she could process trauma without constant media attention. Her daily routine included morning runs through mountain forests that reminded her of pre-military innocence, though she now carried concealed weapons as protection against potential retaliation from surviving conspiracy members. The psychological operations program that had destroyed Elena's military career was officially terminated following congressional investigation. But Elena remained vigilant about signs of similar programs operating under different administrative structures. Her network of sources within military and intelligence agencies provided early warning about psychological manipulation techniques being applied to new victims, allowing intervention before situations escalated to violence. Elena's relationship with institutional authority had been permanently transformed by her experiences. She maintained respectful cooperation with legitimate government oversight agencies while refusing to trust any individual or organization that couldn't provide independent verification of their claims and motivations. Her approach to institutional engagement balanced healthy skepticism with recognition that some government personnel were genuinely committed to preventing abuse rather than covering it up. The congressional hearing room buzzed with the controlled energy of democracy in action as Elena Voss approached the witness table, her footsteps echoing against marble floors that had witnessed decades of testimony designed to hold power accountable to principle. Cameras tracked her movement with the precision of weapon systems, their operators seeking the perfect shot that would capture this moment when an individual's courage intersected with institutional reckoning. Elena wore a simple blue dress suit that projected professional competence without military formality, a careful balance that acknowledged her service record while establishing her current civilian identity. The silver locket at her throat caught light from overhead fixtures, Miguel's memory serving as silent witness to proceedings that would have been impossible without his sacrifice and her determination to honor it through action. Senator Patricia Williams, chairwoman of the Intelligence Oversight Committee, gavelled the hearing to order with the ceremonial authority that transformed individual voices into historical record. Ms. Voss, this committee appreciates your continued cooperation with our investigation into unauthorized psychological operations within military and intelligence agencies. Your testimony has been instrumental in exposing criminal activities that threaten the fundamental integrity of our defense institutions. Elena's response carried the measured confidence of someone who had learned to navigate political machinery without being consumed by it. Thank you, Senator Williams. My goal has always been protecting future service members from experiencing the institutional betrayal that destroyed my military career and cost 24 soldiers their lives. Today's hearing represents another step toward ensuring such operations never happen again. The hearing room contained representatives from military justice, congressional oversight, and civilian advocacy organizations who had spent 3 years investigating the psychological operations program that had manipulated Elena into eliminating her own teammates. Their final report would be published the following week, documenting systematic abuse of psychological manipulation techniques by defense intelligence agency personnel operating without proper authorization or oversight. Elena's testimony focused on recommendations for preventing future psychological operations rather than revisiting details of her personal experience. Her proposals included mandatory psychological screening for personnel involved in behavioral research, independent oversight of all psychological manipulation programs, and legal protections for soldiers reporting suspected abuse of psychological techniques. The fundamental issue, Elena explained to the committee, is that psychological manipulation programs were developed without adequate consideration of their potential for abuse by corrupt personnel. When these techniques are used against American soldiers by their own government, they represent a form of domestic terrorism that undermines the trust essential for effective military operations. Senator Robert Chun, Sarah's uncle and a vocal advocate for military reform, leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose family had been personally affected by institutional corruption. Ms. Voss, your testimony has consistently emphasized the need for cultural change within military and intelligence agencies. Can you elaborate on specific measures that would address the underlying attitudes that enabled these psychological operations? Elena had anticipated this question during months of preparation with advocacy organizations and legal counsel. Her answer reflected lessons learned from 3 years of institutional engagement and reform work. Senator Chun, the most critical change involves establishing clear consequences for personnel who participate in unauthorized psychological manipulation, regardless of their rank or position. Currently, many participants in these programs believed they were following legitimate orders because no clear penalties existed for psychological abuse of fellow service members. The hearing room's atmosphere reflected the gravity of proceedings that would influence military policy for decades. Elena could see journalists taking notes that would become tomorrow's headlines, congressional staff members recording testimony that would shape legislation, and military observers whose reactions would determine whether institutional change occurred through cooperation or continued conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun sat in the gallery behind Elena, her presence providing emotional support while symbolizing the broader network of military personnel who had emerged as advocates for psychological operations reform. Sarah's career had flourished following her decision to support Elena's revelations, demonstrating that institutional change could reward courage rather than punishing it. Her promotion to lieutenant colonel included assignment to a new Pentagon office responsible for preventing psychological abuse within military ranks. Elena's testimony continued for 4 hours, covering technical aspects of psychological manipulation techniques, legal frameworks for preventing abuse, and practical recommendations for protecting service members from institutional betrayal. Her responses demonstrated mastery of complex policy issues while maintaining emotional connection to personal experiences that had motivated her advocacy. The hearing concluded with Senator Williams reading a prepared statement that summarized 3 years of congressional investigation. This committee finds that unauthorized psychological operations conducted by defense intelligence agency personnel violated federal law, military regulations, and basic principles of human dignity. We recommend immediate implementation of Ms. Voss's proposals for preventing future abuse, along with continued oversight to ensure compliance with new protections for military personnel. Elena left the hearing room with the satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal trauma into institutional progress, though she understood that lasting change would require continued vigilance from multiple generations of advocates. The psychological operations program that had destroyed her military career was officially terminated, but new threats to military integrity would inevitably emerge unless democratic oversight remained actively engaged. 5 years later, Dr. Elena Voss stood before a lecture hall filled with military academy cadets whose young faces reflected the same idealistic commitment to service that had once motivated her own enlistment. Her position as professor of military ethics at the United States Military Academy represented the culmination of a journey that had begun in blood and betrayal, but ultimately led to education and prevention. The lecture hall's atmosphere buzzed with intellectual energy as Elena prepared to deliver her signature presentation on institutional loyalty versus individual conscience in military service. This course had become mandatory for all graduating cadets, ensuring that future military leaders understood the ethical complexities of following orders while maintaining personal integrity. Today we'll examine a case study involving psychological manipulation of military personnel by their own government. Elena began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the principles she was teaching. This case demonstrates why individual moral judgment remains essential even within hierarchical institutions that demand obedience to authority. Elena never identified herself as the central figure in the case study she presented, allowing cadets to analyze the ethical dimensions of institutional betrayal without the distracting influence of celebrity or sympathy. Her teaching methodology emphasized critical thinking over emotional reaction, preparing future leaders to recognize and resist psychological manipulation, regardless of its source or claimed justification. Cadet Maria Santos raised her hand with the confidence of someone genuinely engaged by complex ethical questions. Professor Voss, how can individual soldiers distinguish between legitimate psychological pressure and manipulative abuse? Both can involve stress, deception, and demands for behavior that conflicts with personal preferences. Elena smiled at the question's sophistication, recognizing the kind of analytical thinking that would protect future generations from the institutional abuse she had experienced. Excellent question, Cadet Santos. Legitimate military training creates stress to build resilience and effectiveness, but it operates within established ethical frameworks with defined objectives and oversight mechanisms. Psychological manipulation, by contrast, serves hidden agendas and relies on deception about its true purposes and consequences. The lecture continued for 90 minutes, covering historical examples of psychological manipulation in military contexts, while providing practical frameworks for ethical decision-making under institutional pressure. Elena's approach balanced respect for military hierarchy with recognition that some orders and institutional practices required individual resistance rather than compliance. Following the lecture, Elena met privately with cadets who had questions about navigating ethical challenges they might face during their military careers. These conversations represented her most meaningful contribution to military reform, educating future leaders who would inherit responsibility for maintaining institutional integrity, while preventing the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed her faith in service. Cadet Jennifer Park, whose thoughtful questions had impressed Elena during previous classes, approached with the careful deliberation of someone wrestling with complex personal decisions. Professor Voss, I'm committed to military service, but your case studies make me wonder whether institutional loyalty is compatible with individual conscience. How do you maintain faith in an institution after experiencing institutional betrayal? Elena recognized the fundamental question that every idealistic young person faced when confronting evidence of institutional corruption. Her answer reflected years of therapy, advocacy work, and careful consideration of how personal trauma could be transformed into wisdom that served others. Faith in institutions requires distinguishing between institutional ideals and institutional behavior, Elena replied, settling into her chair with the patience of someone who understood that meaningful conversations couldn't be rushed. Military service exists to protect democratic values, but military institutions are operated by human beings who sometimes betray those values through corruption, ambition, or simple moral weakness. She continued, watching Jennifer's expression for signs that her words were resonating with genuine understanding rather than hollow academic concepts. Your challenge as a future leader will be serving institutional ideals while resisting institutional corruption. This requires developing the judgment to recognize when orders or policies contradict the principles that justify military authority. In the first place, Jennifer nodded slowly, her young face reflecting the weight of responsibility that came with genuine leadership preparation. So you're saying that true loyalty to military values sometimes requires disloyalty to military hierarchy? I'm saying that moral courage is the most important quality you can develop as a military leader, Elena responded. Technical competence and tactical knowledge are essential, but they're meaningless without the character to use those skills in service of justice rather than convenience. These conversations with cadets provided Elena with hope that institutional change was possible through education and cultural transformation rather than just legal reform and oversight mechanisms. Each graduating class carried her lessons about ethical leadership into military units, where they would influence thousands of other service members over the course of their careers. 7 years later, Elena's mountain cabin in rural Montana provided the perfect environment for writing her second book, a comprehensive analysis of psychological manipulation techniques used by governments against their own citizens. The isolation allowed deep focus on complex research, while mountain views reminded her daily of perspectives that extended beyond human institutions and their inevitable corruption. Her morning routine began at dawn with coffee and meditation. On the cabin's front porch, where she could observe wildlife moving through forests that had existed long before human political structures and would presumably survive their eventual collapse. These moments of natural perspective helped Elena maintain emotional balance, while writing about subjects that could easily consume someone with anger or despair. The book project had evolved from academic analysis into practical guidance for citizens seeking to recognize and resist psychological manipulation by institutional authorities. Elena's approach emphasized individual resilience and community support networks rather than relying solely on official oversight, mechanisms that could themselves be compromised by the same forces they were supposed to regulate. Elena's research involved extensive collaboration with international experts on government psychological operations, including former intelligence officers from multiple countries who had witnessed similar abuse of behavioral manipulation techniques. Their combined testimony painted a disturbing picture of psychological warfare being conducted by democratic governments against their own populations, using techniques originally developed for foreign intelligence operations. Dr. James Morrison, a retired CIA psychologist who had become a whistleblower after witnessing psychological experiments on American citizens, served as Elena's primary research collaborator. Their weekly video conferences provided opportunities to verify Elena's analysis against his insider knowledge of classified psychological operations programs. Your experience represents just one example of systematic institutional abuse that extends far beyond military applications, Morrison explained during one of their research sessions. Similar techniques are being used against journalists, activists, political dissidents, and anyone else who threatens established power structures. The warehouse incident you survived was essentially a field test of methodologies that are now being applied to civilian targets. Elena's writing process involved transforming technical analysis of psychological manipulation into accessible language that could be understood by readers without specialized background in behavioral psychology or intelligence operations. Her goal was educating ordinary citizens about sophisticated influence techniques being used against them, while providing practical strategies for maintaining independent thought under institutional pressure. The cabin's isolation was occasionally interrupted by visits from other advocates and survivors, who had become part of Elena's extended network of support and collaboration. Sarah Chun made quarterly trips to Montana, bringing updates about military reform efforts while providing emotional connection to Elena's former life and institutional service. During Sarah's most recent visit, they had hiked through mountain forests while discussing progress toward establishing international oversight mechanisms for government psychological operations. Sarah's current position as Director of Military Ethics at the Pentagon provided insider perspective on institutional resistance to reform, while Elena's external advocacy offered strategies for applying public pressure when internal change proved insufficient. The institutional response has been mixed, Sarah had explained while they paused at a scenic overlook that provided views of valleys stretching toward distant horizons. Senior leadership acknowledges the need for reform, but middle management resists changes that would reduce their operational flexibility. We're making progress, but it's slower than either of us would prefer. Elena appreciated Sarah's honest assessment of institutional change dynamics, understanding that lasting reform required years of sustained pressure rather than dramatic breakthrough moments. Their friendship had evolved into professional partnership based on complementary capabilities. Sarah's insider access combined with Elena's external credibility to create influence that neither could achieve independently. Elena's book writing was interrupted periodically by speaking engagements at universities, law enforcement academies, and international conferences on human rights. These presentations provided opportunities to share her analysis with audiences who could implement her recommendations in their own institutional contexts. The most meaningful speaking engagement had occurred at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where Elena testified about psychological manipulation as a form of torture that violated international human rights law. Her testimony contributed to legal precedents that would protect future victims, while establishing criminal liability for government personnel who authorized psychological abuse of civilians or military personnel. Elena's testimony had been covered extensively by international media, transforming her from American military whistleblower into global symbol of resistance against institutional abuse of psychological manipulation techniques. But she remained focused on practical impact rather than symbolic status, measuring success through concrete changes in policy and law rather than media attention or public recognition. 10 years later, Elena's mountain cabin had been expanded into a retreat center where survivors of institutional betrayal could process trauma while developing skills for effective advocacy. The facility hosted quarterly workshops that brought together military veterans, intelligence agency whistleblowers, law enforcement officers, and civilian activists who had experienced systematic psychological manipulation by institutional authorities. Retreat Center's mission focused on healing and empowerment rather than simply documenting abuse or seeking legal remedies. Elena's approach emphasized practical skills for recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation while building resilient communities that could support individuals facing institutional pressure. This morning's workshop session included 12 participants whose experiences ranged from military psychological operations to corporate retaliation campaigns to organized harassment by law enforcement agencies. Elena facilitated group discussions that allowed participants to share their experiences while learning from others who had faced similar challenges. The key insight, Elena explained to the group assembled in the center's main meeting room, is understanding that psychological manipulation relies on isolation and self-doubt. When you realize that your experience follows predictable patterns used against many other people, you begin to regain the confidence and clarity that manipulation is designed to destroy. Workshop participant David Martinez, a former FBI agent, who had been targeted for psychological pressure after reporting corruption within his field office, raised his hand with a question that reflected genuine engagement with the material. Elena, how do you maintain effectiveness as an advocate without becoming consumed by anger or paranoia about institutional corruption? I struggle with balancing appropriate vigilance against excessive suspicion. Elena smiled at David's question, recognizing the psychological challenge that every survivor of institutional betrayal eventually faced. That's perhaps the most important question you can ask, David. Effective advocacy requires maintaining emotional balance while staying intellectually honest about institutional threats. I've found that focusing on specific, achievable goals helps prevent the kind of generalized anger that can undermine your credibility and effectiveness. She continued, observing the group's reactions to ensure her words were providing practical guidance rather than abstract philosophy. The goal isn't eliminating all institutional corruption. That's probably impossible given human nature. The goal is creating systems that make corruption more difficult and more likely to be exposed when it occurs. Small victories accumulate into larger changes over time. The workshop sessions continued throughout the weekend, covering topics that ranged from legal strategies for challenging institutional retaliation to psychological techniques for maintaining mental health under pressure. Elena's curriculum had been refined through years of working with survivors whose experiences provided insights into effective resistance methods. Sunday morning's final session focused on action planning, where participants developed specific strategies for implementing workshop lessons in their individual circumstances. Elena provided one-on-one consultation to help each participant identify realistic goals while avoiding strategies that might provoke unnecessary retaliation from institutional opponents. As participants prepared to leave the retreat center, Elena felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal trauma into systematic help for others facing similar challenges. Each workshop graduate became part of a growing network of individuals equipped to recognize and resist institutional psychological manipulation, while supporting others who faced similar threats. The retreat center's impact extended beyond individual healing to influence broader institutional reform efforts. Graduates frequently became advocates within their own organizations, applying workshop lessons to prevent psychological abuse while building internal support networks for potential future victims. 15 years later, Elena stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, delivering keynote testimony for the adoption of international protocols prohibiting government use of psychological manipulation against civilians and military personnel. Her presentation represented the culmination of 15 years of advocacy work that had evolved from personal survival into global human rights leadership. The UN Assembly Hall contained representatives from 193 member nations whose votes would determine whether psychological manipulation would be formally recognized as a human rights violation subject to international legal sanctions. Elena's testimony would influence decisions that could protect millions of future victims, while establishing criminal liability for government personnel who authorize psychological abuse. Honorable delegates, Elena began, her voice carrying across the assembly hall with the authority of someone whose personal experience had been transformed into universal principle. Psychological manipulation by government authorities represents a fundamental violation of human dignity that threatens the foundation of democratic governance and individual freedom. Her presentation included documentation from cases spanning multiple continents and government systems, demonstrating that psychological manipulation was being used systematically against journalists, activists, military personnel, and ordinary citizens who challenged institutional authority. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of psychological warfare being conducted by democratic governments against their own populations. Elena's testimony was supported by a coalition of international human rights organizations, military reform advocates, and survivor networks that had developed during years of collaborative advocacy work. Their combined influence represented unprecedented global consensus about the need for international legal protections against institutional psychological abuse. The vote that followed Elena's presentation was overwhelming. 147 nations supported adoption of the International Protocol on Psychological Manipulation, with only 12 opposing votes and 34 abstentions. The protocol would require signatory nations to criminalize government use of psychological manipulation, while establishing international oversight mechanisms for investigating alleged violations. Elena watched the vote tally with emotions that ranged from professional satisfaction to personal vindication. The protocol represented legal recognition of principles she had developed through surviving institutional betrayal and transforming that experience into advocacy for broader human rights protections. Following the UN session, Elena met privately with representatives from human rights organizations worldwide who were implementing the new protocol within their national contexts. These conversations focused on practical strategies for translating international law into domestic legal protections while building public awareness about psychological manipulation techniques. Dr. Sarah Chun, now serving as Deputy Secretary of Defense for Military Ethics, joined Elena for dinner in Geneva to discuss implementation of the new protocol within American military and intelligence agencies. Their friendship had evolved into professional partnership that spanned decades of collaborative reform work. The protocol creates legal framework we've been working toward for 15 years, Sarah explained over dinner at a restaurant overlooking Lake Geneva. But enforcement will require continued advocacy pressure to ensure government agencies comply with international obligations rather than simply ignoring them. Elena nodded, understanding that legal victories represented beginning rather than conclusion of effective reform efforts. The next phase involves educating citizens about their rights under the new protocol, while building support networks for people who experience psychological manipulation. Legal protections are meaningless unless people understand how to use them. Their conversation continued late into the evening, covering strategies for maintaining momentum toward institutional reform while preventing backsliding when public attention moved to other issues. Both women understood that lasting change required sustained effort over multiple generations rather than dramatic breakthrough moments. Elena's hotel room that night provided views of Geneva's lights reflecting on lake water that seemed to mirror the broader illumination her advocacy work had brought to subjects previously hidden in institutional shadows. The warehouse where she had eliminated 24 men felt like ancient history, though she understood that those deaths had been necessary steps toward preventing countless future victims. Miguel's photograph, now carried in a small frame rather than the original locket, set on Elena's nightstand as permanent reminder of the personal costs that had motivated her transformation from soldier into advocate. His memory remained her constant companion through years of testimony, writing, teaching, and international advocacy that had honored his sacrifice by protecting others from similar institutional betrayal. Elena's dreams that night were peaceful. For the first time in years, filled with images of mountain forests and clear lakes rather than warehouse shadows and tactical lighting. She had finally achieved the justice that Miguel's death demanded while building legal protections that would prevent future brothers and sisters from facing similar sacrifice. 20 years later, Elena Voss, now recognized internationally as the leading expert on institutional psychological manipulation, stood in the same warehouse district where her journey had begun 2 decades earlier. The original warehouse had been demolished and replaced with the memorial park for victims of institutional betrayal, but the surrounding area retained industrial character that reminded visitors of democracy's ongoing struggle against authoritarian abuse. The memorial ceremony was being held to commemorate the 20th anniversary of what historians now called the warehouse incident, the night when 24 soldiers died exposing the psychological operations program that had violated fundamental human rights principles. Elena had reluctantly agreed to speak at the ceremony, understanding that public commemoration served educational purposes even when it required revisiting painful personal memories. Several hundred attendees included family members of the soldiers Elena had killed, military personnel who had implemented reforms inspired by her advocacy, congressional representatives who had passed legislation protecting service members from psychological abuse, and international human rights advocates who had used her case as precedent for broader protections. Elena's speech focused on lessons learned rather than events remembered, emphasizing how individual courage could catalyze institutional change when supported by persistent advocacy and international pressure. Her remarks avoided specific details about the elimination methods she had used, instead highlighting how exposure of institutional corruption had led to legal protections that now benefited millions of people worldwide. 20 years ago, institutional betrayal convinced me that violence was my only option for seeking justice, Elena told the assembled crowd. Today, young people facing similar betrayal have legal protections, advocacy networks, and international oversight mechanisms that provide alternatives to the path I was forced to take. That transformation represents progress worth celebrating, even as we acknowledge the human costs that made it possible. The memorial park's design included individual monuments for each of the 24 soldiers, acknowledging their deaths while providing context about the institutional corruption that had led to their participation in psychological manipulation programs. Elena had participated in designing these monuments, ensuring they honored the soldiers' service while educating visitors about the systemic problems that had caused their deaths. Following the ceremony, Elena met privately with Maria Santos, daughter of one of the soldiers she had killed 20 years earlier. Maria had grown up hearing conflicting stories about her father's death, ultimately choosing to pursue military service herself while advocating for ethical reform within institutional structures. "I spent years hating you for killing my father," Maria said as they walked together through the memorial park. "But researching his involvement in psychological operations helped me understand that you were as much a victim as he was. The real criminals were the people who manipulated both of you into that warehouse." Elena appreciated Maria's mature perspective on events that had defined both their lives in profound ways. "Your father was a good soldier who believed he was following legitimate orders from trusted superiors. His death was tragic, but it served purposes he would have supported if he had understood the broader context of institutional corruption he was being used to protect." Their conversation continued for more than an hour, covering Maria's current work developing military ethics training programs that incorporated lessons learned from psychological operations abuse. Elena provided encouragement and practical advice based on decades of advocacy experience, helping Maria navigate institutional resistance while maintaining effectiveness as a reform advocate. Elena's final act at the memorial ceremony involved placing a wreath at Miguel's monument, which had been included in the memorial design to acknowledge victims of the broader conspiracy that had culminated in the warehouse incident. Miguel's monument bore a simple inscription: "Sergeant Miguel Voss, died seeking truth, honored through justice." As Elena stood before Miguel's monument, she felt the deep peace that comes from completing a mission that had defined her adult life. Her brother's death had been avenged not through simple revenge, but through systematic reform that would protect countless future victims from similar institutional betrayal. The warehouse where she had once hunted human prey was now consecrated ground where democracy's commitment to human dignity was reaffirmed through public ceremony and private reflection. Elena's journey from soldier to advocate was finally complete. Though she understood that the work of protecting human dignity from institutional abuse would require continued effort from future generations, she had provided foundation and example. Others would build upon her legacy, while facing new challenges that couldn't yet be anticipated. The silver locket that had carried Miguel's photograph through years of combat and advocacy now rested in a place of honor at the memorial park, a permanent reminder that individual sacrifice could serve universal principles when channeled through persistent effort toward institutional change. Elena had finally kept her promise to honor her brother's memory through action that transcended personal grief to serve broader human rights principles. As Elena left the memorial park for the final time, walking toward a future no longer defined by the past's trauma, she whispered the words that had sustained her through 20 years of advocacy: "Subscribe to justice, where silence is never forgotten." Elena Voss had transformed personal betrayal into institutional change, individual trauma into universal protection, and military service into human rights advocacy. Her legacy would endure through legal protections, educational programs, and international oversight mechanisms that honored every victim of institutional psychological manipulation while preventing countless future tragedies. The warehouse was gone, but the principles Elena had defended through violence and vindicated through advocacy would protect generations of service members and civilians from the institutional betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable. Justice had been served not through revenge, but through the patient work of building systems that made such revenge unnecessary. Miguel's memory lived on, not just in his sister's advocacy, but in international law that bore witness to his sacrifice, while protecting others from similar loss. The brother and sister who had served their country in uniform had ultimately served humanity through their unwitting participation in events that exposed and reformed institutional abuse of psychological manipulation. Elena's transformation from useless soldier to global human rights leader demonstrated that institutional definitions of worth could be transcended through individual courage sustained by community support and international solidarity. Her story had become proof that democracy's promise of justice could be redeemed even when democratic institutions failed their most fundamental obligations to human dignity. Thank you for experiencing this intense journey with us. Creating these detailed stories requires significant time and dedication. If you enjoyed this thrilling tale, please like this video, share it with fellow story lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating content.